My name is Jacqueline Lynch, and if you asked anyone in my family to describe me, I'm pretty sure the words quiet, reliable, and invisible would come up. I'm 38 years old, a nonprofit financial manager by profession, meaning I spend my days juggling budgets, grant applications, and spreadsheets that decide if vital community programs get funded or not. At work, I'm meticulous, calm under pressure, and someone people depend on to keep the lights on and the mission alive. But at home, I'm the family member who quietly carries the weight, behind the scenes without so much as a thank you. Every month, without fail, I send $6,000 toward my parents' mortgage. This isn't a loan or a favor. It's just what I do. I don't advertise it. No one asks, and no one acknowledges it. I guess to my family, money is just money, and generosity is often invisible when it's expected. They see the dinners, the holidays, the celebrations, and maybe assume I'm just like any other sibling who shows up. But the truth is, I'm footing a massive portion of the financial burden that keeps the Lynch family home standing. I've done this for years, all while balancing a demanding career and raising my own children. It's a strange feeling, being the one everyone leans on but no one actually recognizes. When I come home from work, tired but proud that I managed to close yet another grant on time, I'm met with polite smiles and polite questions about my day. "How's work?" they ask. "Everything's good," I say, not wanting to dive into the exhaustion or the stress, because I know what's coming next. A subtle dig, a sideways glance, or worse, silence. I've learned to brace myself for family dinners that feel more like minefields than moments of connection. Last weekend was no different. We gathered around the old oak dining table, its surface worn from years of shared meals and conversations that never quite reached the heart of things. The clinking of silverware on plates mingled with small talk about the weather, the news, and the neighborhood. But beneath the surface, tension simmered like an undercurrent ready to break through. Samuel, my older brother, sat across from me with that familiar smirk playing on his lips. He's always been charming, the kind of person who commands attention without trying too hard. But charm can mask a sharp edge, and tonight, it was pointed directly at me. Midway through the meal, as if the words had been rehearsed, Samuel leaned back and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mom and Dad say you never contribute anything to this family." The room went quiet for a heartbeat, then a few chuckles. My mother's smile faltered, and my father's eyes flicked away, as if avoiding a confrontation they'd rather pretend didn't exist. The sting of those words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the accusation. It was the blatant dismissal of years of sacrifices I'd made quietly, without a single complaint. I sat there, my hands folded tightly on my lap, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My husband, Thomas, caught my gaze across the table. He always knows when I'm hurt, even if I don't say a word. He squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder that I'm not alone. But inside, I felt the familiar ache of invisibility, of being seen as less than I am. It was a moment that crystallized something I'd been ignoring for too long. The realization that my family's version of contribution was narrow and unforgiving, and I was no longer willing to play by their rules. That night, as the dishes were cleared and the laughter resumed, I sat quietly, turning Samuel's words over and over in my mind. The truth hovered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. To my family, I was invisible, unappreciated, and easily dismissed, but I wasn't about to let that define me. Not anymore. Growing up, the dynamics in our family were crystal clear, even if they were never openly discussed. Samuel was the golden child. He could do no wrong, at least in the eyes of Mom and Dad. Praise was his birthright. I remember vividly how, from early childhood, his every success was celebrated with warmth and applause. When he got a good grade, we'd hear about it for days. When he scored a goal at soccer, his trophies took center stage on the living room shelf, polished and gleaming. He was the one who got the big hugs and the "I'm so proud of you" looks. His needs and wants were anticipated, his mistakes forgiven or overlooked. Meanwhile, I was the quiet shadow trailing behind, the one who never quite measured up. It wasn't just overt favoritism. It was the little things that etched themselves into my memory and shaped my self-worth. If I spoke up, my voice was often drowned out or dismissed. When I made a mistake, even the smallest one, it was amplified. I still remember the time in 3rd grade when I accidentally spilled juice on the carpet during a family gathering. Samuel, on the other hand, could crash a bike or forget his homework repeatedly, and it would barely register beyond a parental sigh. But for me, that spilled juice meant a lecture, a scolding look from Mom, and a sense that I was somehow careless and irresponsible. Family dinners were a particular minefield. Samuel would be regaled with stories of his exploits and future plans, while my contributions, academic or otherwise, were barely acknowledged. The subtle lines drawn between us were unmistakable. "Jacqueline, you should try harder," or "Why can't you be more like your brother?" were phrases that echoed through my formative years, etching a permanent sense of inadequacy. I learned early to suppress my disappointment and play the role assigned to me, the quiet, obedient daughter who was expected to conform and not rock the boat. There was a sharp contrast in how my sacrifices were perceived compared to Samuel's. Over the years, I helped care for Mom during her bouts of illness, often rearranging my schedule to be there when they needed extra help. I quietly paid for repairs and contributed financially whenever there was a shortfall. Yet, these efforts were invisible to everyone but me. If I tried to mention them, they were brushed aside or minimized. "That's what family is for," was the common refrain. But it always felt like a one-way street. The sacrifices I made were treated as obligations, or even chances to prove my worth, rather than acts of love or generosity. Samuel, with his charm and confidence, often got away with selfishness that would have drawn criticism if I had exhibited the same behavior. I remember him coming home late from parties, carefree and unapologetic, while I was held to impossible standards of responsibility and decorum. My parents excused his lapses as youthful indiscretions, but my mistakes, no matter how minor, were magnified and held as evidence of my supposed shortcomings. Over time, I tried to rationalize this dynamic as family quirks, convincing myself that this imbalance was somehow normal. After all, families are complicated, and nobody is perfect. I buried my resentment deep, telling myself that keeping the peace was more important than being recognized. But beneath that calm exterior, the sense of being overlooked and undervalued simmered relentlessly. The favoritism wasn't just unfair, it was corrosive, eroding my self-esteem and planting the seeds of doubt about my place in the family. I can't count the times I wondered, why is it that the same parents who celebrated Samuel's every step barely acknowledge my sacrifices? Why am I the one who ends up feeling invisible, even when I'm doing everything to hold this family together? The truth is, those childhood wounds shaped the way I navigated every family interaction. Always careful, always restrained, always hoping not to be the next target of disappointment or blame. But those patterns, those deep-seated inequities, didn't just disappear with time. They only grew more entrenched. And as I sat that night at the dinner table, hearing Samuel's cutting words, I realized that this favoritism wasn't just childhood history. It was a living, breathing dynamic that still governed who I was in my family's eyes. The realization was painful, but undeniable. No matter how much I gave, I was still the one sidelined, still the one blamed, still the one invisible. Despite feeling unacknowledged, I kept pushing myself to do more, sometimes beyond what I thought I could bear. It wasn't just about money, though the $6,000 a month I sent to cover my parents' mortgage was a huge part of it. It was the quiet, constant care that no one seemed to notice or appreciate. When Mom's health dipped, I rearranged my entire schedule to be there, dropping important meetings, missing social events, even sacrificing my own weekends to help with doctor's appointments, medication management, and the endless errands that come with caring for aging parents. I remember the winter when the old heating system broke down, right before Christmas no less. Samuel was out of town on some business trip, and the house was freezing. I stepped in without hesitation, hiring a repair crew, negotiating costs, and covering the repairs myself. When I brought it up at the next family gathering, expecting maybe a simple thank you or relief, the subject was swiftly changed. "That's just what family does," Mom said with a dismissive wave, as if my efforts were nothing more than a routine chore. And it wasn't only emergencies or medical care. I funded routine maintenance, replacing roof shingles, fixing leaky faucets, and repainting the porch. Each time, I stayed silent about the bills because I didn't want to make a fuss. But in the quiet moments when I sifted through the bank statements, balancing every check and receipt, I couldn't help but feel the sting of invisibility. How many times had I put my own savings on hold to keep this roof over our heads? How many times had I sacrificed personal luxuries so that the Lynch family legacy, our home, would endure? My husband, Thomas, saw the toll it took on me, even when no one else did. He's an accountant by trade, so he understood the numbers behind my sacrifices better than anyone. After a particularly exhausting week of juggling work deadlines and late-night caregiving calls from Mom, he sat me down in our small living room. "Jock, you can't keep doing this alone," he said gently. "You're drowning in everyone else's problems. You're bending over backward for people who don't even realize what you're doing." His voice was calm but urgent, and for the first time, I felt the weight of his concern sinking in. Thomas wanted me to stand up for myself more, to demand the respect and recognition I deserved, but I hesitated. Family loyalty ran deep in my veins, and I had been conditioned to keep the peace, even if it cost me. Still, his support made a difference. When family gatherings rolled around, he accompanied me, offering moral support when Samuel's sharp remarks cut through the room. He tried to amplify my voice when mine was drowned out or ignored, but even with his help, the dynamics rarely shifted. At those dinners, I found myself slipping into old patterns, offering to help with meal prep, asking if anyone needed a ride to appointments, or quietly suggesting financial advice to ease the burden on Mom and Dad. Each offer was met with polite smiles or vague thanks, but no real acknowledgement. It was as if my presence and my help were taken for granted, like the air itself, always there, but never truly noticed. One evening, as I helped Mom organize her medications and upcoming doctor visits, she brushed past my efforts with a sigh. "You don't have to do everything, Jacqueline," she said, avoiding my eyes. But I knew better. If I didn't do it, no one would. The responsibility always fell on me. That's the paradox. My family's silence wasn't absence. It was expectation. They expected me to bear the weight, quietly and without complaint. I sometimes thought about turning down that promotion at work, the one that would have required more travel and longer hours. But when Mom fell ill unexpectedly, I chose to stay close to home instead. Career growth was important, but my family needed me more. I convinced myself it was a temporary sacrifice, a test of loyalty. Yet, deep down, the question lingered. Would anyone notice if I stepped back? Would anyone truly care? Despite all this, I held on to a fragile hope that maybe, someday, my family would see me, not just as the silent financier or the caregiver, but as a person worthy of respect and gratitude. I kept records, quietly tracking every dollar, every hour, every favor. These numbers were my truth, my evidence against the narrative that I was never contributing. But those records remained hidden, tucked away like a secret ledger of love and sacrifice that no one else was allowed to see. Still, every dinner, every gathering, every casual comment chipped away at that hope. The silence in response to my efforts was deafening. I started to understand that my family's definition of contribution was narrow and exclusive, centered around Samuel's charm and visible successes, not the quiet, persistent work that kept everything afloat. And yet, I continued, because that's what you do when you love people who don't always love you back the way you deserve. You keep trying, hoping the next moment will be different. But the truth was beginning to dawn on me. Maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe I was carrying a burden no one else would share. And maybe it was time to stop carrying it alone. That family celebration could have been just another routine gathering. Plates piled high with comfort food, the clatter of forks and knives mingling with half-hearted laughter, and the usual dance of polite conversation. But beneath that surface, the simmering tension between Samuel and me was palpable, like a thin thread stretched taut, waiting to snap. I was already bracing myself, knowing that the masks would slip, if only for a moment, revealing the undercurrent of disdain I'd come to expect. The evening began with the usual pleasantries. My mother fussed over the seating arrangement, casting encouraging glances at Samuel, while I quietly took my place at the table, aware that my presence was more tolerated than welcomed. The scent of roast beef and rosemary filled the room, mixing with the faint aroma of antique wood from the dining table that had borne witness to countless family dramas. My husband, Thomas, sat beside me, offering a small, reassuring smile, the kind that said, "I see you. I'm with you." As the meal progressed, the conversation meandered through safe topics: the weather, neighborhood news, and the latest updates on distant relatives. I contributed when I could, offering thoughts on a community fundraiser I'd recently helped organize or mentioning a new budgeting system I had implemented at work. My words were met with polite nods, the kind that felt more like routine acknowledgments than genuine interest. Then, as if on cue, Samuel shifted the energy in the room. He leaned back in his chair, a smug smile curling at the corners of his mouth, eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and something darker, disdain. "You know," he said, voice loud enough to draw every eye, "Mom and Dad say Jacqueline's job isn't really work, just some desk thing shuffling papers all day. Not like a real job that brings home the bacon." A ripple of laughter followed, light but unmistakably mocking. The way the room responded, how their eyes darted between him and me, felt like a public indictment. My mother's smile faltered. She looked down at her napkin, fingers twisting nervously. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence that followed Samuel's jab was thick, heavy with unspoken judgments. I forced myself to breathe, to keep my composure as a hot wave of humiliation flooded through me. That phrase, "not real work," was a dagger aimed right at my sense of self. In my profession, I managed millions of dollars, directed resources that saved lives and uplifted communities. Yet, here I was, reduced to a caricature of not real work in front of the people who mattered most. The sting was painful, sharper because it came from my own brother, from my own family. Thomas squeezed my hand discreetly, his eyes locking on mine, a silent anchor in the storm. I wanted to speak, to defend the countless hours I'd poured into my career, to explain the lives impacted by my work, but I knew it would fall on deaf ears. The family's laughter echoed in my mind, a cruel soundtrack to a long-standing pattern of dismissal. That night, as the conversation moved on and the veneer of normalcy returned, I felt my isolation deepen. Samuel's words weren't just an offhand insult. They were a reflection of how deeply the family undervalued me. It was as if my quiet contributions, the sacrifices hidden behind closed doors, simply didn't count. The emotional weight of being invisible in my own family settled heavily on my shoulders. I remembered the countless nights I stayed late at the office, the phone calls with grant writers, the spreadsheets scrutinized until every cent was accounted for. None of that mattered here. What mattered was Samuel's loud declaration, delivered with such confidence that it silenced any hope of rebuttal. The family's laughter was a chorus of dismissal, a public affirmation of my invisibility. In that moment, I realized that my place in the family was not going to change by waiting for acknowledgement, or by continuing to prove myself to people who refused to see me. The celebration, meant to be a joyous occasion, had instead become a glaring reminder of how deeply entrenched the favoritism and disregard were. The wounds inflicted by childhood had not healed. They had only festered beneath the surface, waiting for occasions like this to resurface. As I looked around the table, I noticed my parents' avoidance, the way Mom busied herself with clearing plates, and Dad stared at his glass, as if the confrontation wasn't happening in his presence. Their silence was deafening, a tacit endorsement of Samuel's words. The family had once again chosen the familiar narrative: Samuel the golden child, me, the scapegoat. Yet, despite the humiliation and the hurt, a quiet resolve began to take root inside me. This wasn't just about one hurtful comment. It was about reclaiming my voice, my worth, and my dignity. But how? That question lingered as the laughter faded and the evening wore on, leaving me with a growing conviction that the next time I faced this family, I would no longer be silent. That latest family dinner was supposed to be just another routine evening, Plates clinking, polite chatter, the hum of familiarity that I once found comforting, but had long since come to dread. We gathered around the familiar oak table, its surface marred by years of spills and scratches, a silent witness to 1,000 unspoken tensions. The scent of roast chicken and herbs filled the air as the conversation floated between updates on jobs, neighborhood gossip, and the endless small talk that never got to the heart of anything real. I sat there, careful not to draw too much attention to myself. As usual, Thomas sat beside me, his presence a quiet support, a lifeline if I needed it. Across from me was Samuel, his smile sharp, eyes gleaming with that familiar mixture of charm and something darker, a silent challenge. It was almost as if he relished these moments, like a predator savoring the discomfort he inflicted. And then, just as the conversation lulled into a safe, dull rhythm, Samuel leaned back in his chair and said it, loud enough for everyone to hear, and with deliberate clarity, "Mom and Dad say you never contribute anything to this family." The words hung in the air, a cruel pronouncement that shattered the fragile calm. For a heartbeat, all I could do was stare at him, stunned by the sheer audacity. Sure, I'd felt unseen, unappreciated, and yes, dismissed before, but this public declaration of my supposed worthlessness, cut deeper than any subtle neglect. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict handed down by the people who should have been my greatest allies. The room reacted in a way that felt surreal. There was a pause, a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest, and then, almost unbelievably, a ripple of applause. Not hesitant, not uncertain, applause. My mother's smile faltered, as if she suddenly realized the weight of the words, but felt powerless to undo them. Her hands trembled slightly as she dabbed at her lips with her napkin, avoiding my gaze. My father's eyes darted away to his glass, then fixed on the table, jaw clenched tight as if swallowing a bitter pill. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes, a tacit agreement, an unwillingness to confront the truth Samuel laid bare. I felt Thomas's hand slip into mine under the table, a lifeline of solidarity amid the storm. Our fingers entwined gently, a silent conversation between us. I squeezed back, silently telling him I was still standing, still present, still fighting, if only in my own quiet way. But inside, the world was unraveling. That phrase, "you never contribute," echoed relentlessly in my mind. It was a lie, a cruel distortion of all the years I'd devoted to this family without a single complaint. I remembered the mortgage payments I'd made without ever asking for acknowledgement, the countless hours I'd spent sitting with Mom during her hospital stays, the repairs I'd quietly funded, the sacrifices I'd swallowed whole. None of it mattered here. None of it counted. The family, once a haven of shared love and support, had become a courtroom where I was judged and found guilty without evidence. Samuel's accusation was their verdict, and their applause was a sentence. The humiliation was suffocating, a slow, burning pain that settled deep into my bones. Around the table, eyes flickered. Some avoided mine altogether. Others stole glances at Thomas, perhaps sensing the growing tension but unwilling to intervene. My brother's triumphant smirk widened, as if he'd just delivered a knockout blow in a fight I hadn't even signed up for. I forced a smile, brittle and hollow, the kind that masks a storm beneath. My hands were clenched tightly in my lap, nails digging into skin I barely noticed. I felt dizzy, not from the alcohol in my glass, but from the shock of being so thoroughly erased. As the evening ground on, conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. The clatter of silverware, the murmurs of idle chatter, they all felt like sounds from a distant world, disconnected from the fracture running through the room. I sat quietly, my mind racing, replaying Samuel's words over and over, the weight of years of neglect, favoritism, and silent sacrifice pressed on me like a physical force. I caught Thomas's eye again, and this time his gaze was steady, unwavering, no pity, no anger, just understanding. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't the only one who saw the injustice. He saw it too, and he stood with me. My parents remained silent, their faces guarded and pale. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line, and Dad's stare was fixed somewhere beyond the windows, lost in thought, or perhaps in denial. The family's complicity was clear. Their choice to applaud Samuel's words, rather than defend me, was a wound that ran deeper than any insult. That night, as the plates were cleared away and the room fell into an uneasy quiet, the invisible barrier between me and the rest of my family became painfully real. I was no longer just the quiet daughter, the background figure who kept things running. I was something else now, a person forced out of the shadows by the cruel spotlight of accusation. The question that burned inside me as I looked around that table wasn't just about the words Samuel had spoken. It was about what came next. How long could I endure being seen as less than I am? How much longer would I accept being the family's secret financier, their invisible caretaker, their scapegoat? In the midst of the humiliation, a quiet resolve began to take shape. This moment was a reckoning, not just for Samuel's words, but for all the years I'd been silent. I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. I could no longer let their narrow definition of contribution erase who I truly am. The night ended with polite goodbyes that felt hollow and rehearsed. But inside me, something had shifted. The family's applause for Samuel's cruel declaration was not the final word. It was the spark that would light a fire, one that, when it burned bright enough, could no longer be ignored. Later that night, after the lingering echoes of the family dinner had faded, and the house had finally fallen silent, I found myself alone in the quiet of our living room. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened, and as I sank into the worn armchair near the window, the city lights outside blurred through my tears. The moment wasn't just painful, it was shattering. Samuel's words circled my mind like vultures, each repetition gnawing a little deeper. You never contribute anything to this family. But I knew the truth, didn't I? I knew what I had done, quietly, without fanfare, without expectation of applause or validation. My fingers instinctively reached for the small stack of envelopes and bank statements I kept hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk, a secret ledger of sorts. There, lined up neatly, were the proof of every check I'd sent toward their mortgage, $6,000 every single month for years. The ones they pretended didn't exist. I pulled them out, tracing the dates with my eyes, feeling the cold weight of each one like a ghost pressing down on me. I flipped to the calendar on my phone, scrolling back through months marked with reminders, doctor appointments for Mom, calls I'd made late at night to schedule repairs, the countless hours I'd spent balancing their bills while simultaneously juggling my own work deadlines and the chaos of raising my children. Each event was a testament to a lifetime of sacrifice. The thought of all those moments, unseen, unacknowledged, even dismissed, made my chest tighten with grief. Grief settled over me first, a crushing wave that threatened to drown me in its depth. I thought of the countless times I'd swallowed my hurt, pretending the sharp edges of neglect didn't cut so deeply. I remembered my mother's distracted glances as I offered to help, my father's quiet avoidance when I tried to speak up, Samuel's mocking smirks. The pain was raw, like an old wound reopened. I mourned the family I had hoped for, the one where my efforts would be met with kindness rather than contempt. But then, as the night stretched on, that grief began to transform. It shifted, swirling into a fiery anger that burned away the fog of sadness. How dare they? How could they sit there applauding such a cruel lie? How could my parents, the people I'd devoted so much to, allow my brother to publicly brand me as worthless without so much as a word of defense? The injustice of it set my blood on fire. I clenched my fists, feeling the surge of strength that came from refusing to be erased. Anger gave way to a cold, clear clarity, a razor-sharp realization cutting through years of confusion and self-doubt. I saw the pattern for what it truly was, a calculated erasure of my sacrifices, a denial of my dignity, and an entitlement that had been allowed to fester unchecked. The family was not just blind to my contributions, they were willfully ignorant, using their narrow definition of contribution as a weapon to control me, to keep me silent and compliant. The phrase, "you never contribute," wasn't a casual insult. It was a lie designed to marginalize me and maintain their comfortable narrative. And I, who had spent so long rationalizing their behavior as family quirks, finally refused to accept it anymore. No longer would I tolerate being the invisible one, the financial backbone mistaken for weakness, the caretaker whose labor was invisible. I thought about the mortgage payments I'd been sending, the ones that kept the family home standing while everyone else acted as if the house was paid for by magic. I thought about the nights I stayed up late, coordinating repairs for leaking pipes, or making sure Mom's medications were refilled on time. I thought about the vacations I'd canceled, the personal dreams I'd shelved so I could be the family's quiet savior. And in that moment, the truth crystallized. I owed them nothing. Not 1 cent more. Not 1 hour more. Not 1 ounce of patience for their callousness. A deep breath filled my lungs as I sat back, feeling the weight of years lift ever so slightly. The path ahead wasn't clear yet. I wasn't sure how I would confront them or what the fallout might be. But one thing was undeniable. They would never change. Their blindness, their entitlement, their unwillingness to see me for who I truly am, was a wall I could no longer climb around or break through with words alone. Tonight, in the stillness, I made a silent vow to myself. I would no longer be the family's invisible giver, the unacknowledged supporter. I would reclaim my worth, not through their approval, but by setting boundaries they couldn't ignore. The fire inside me burned brighter now, not with resentment for its own sake, but as a quiet, steady force of resolve. I was done playing the role they wrote for me. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I gathered the papers, the mortgage checks, the receipts, the carefully recorded caregiving notes, and placed them in a neat stack on the coffee table. These were my invisible gifts, my unspoken truth, and soon, very soon, they would have to face it. That night, after the family gathering had dissolved into the usual uneasy silence, I sat alone in our quiet living room, the weight of Samuel's words settling deep inside me. The phrase, "you never contribute," kept echoing relentlessly, like a broken record playing over and over in my mind. But I knew, with a clarity that surprised even me, that the truth was far from what they said. I reached for the thick envelope tucked away in the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I rarely touched, except when I needed to remind myself that my sacrifices were real, measurable, undeniable. Inside were the neatly organized copies of every mortgage payment I'd made over the past several years. Each check, each bank transfer, each confirmation slip a silent testament to the role I had played in holding this family's foundation together. $6,000 a month, every month, without fail. The house that sheltered us all was standing because of me, even if no one else cared to see or admit it. Flipping through the pages, I traced my finger along the dates: July 2018, November 2019, February 2021. Each mark held stories I never shared. Nights I worked late to cover the cost of unexpected repairs. Weekends I canceled plans to take Mom to doctor appointments. Mornings I sacrificed sleep to respond to urgent calls from home while juggling my demanding nonprofit job. These weren't just payments and receipts. They were proof that my presence wasn't invisible. It was simply ignored. But financial support was only one part of the equation. I thought about the caregiving hours I'd logged in a worn notebook I kept hidden in my closet. A record of every hospital visit, every emergency call, every prescription refill that I coordinated quietly in the background. The countless rides to specialists, the hours sitting by Mom's bedside when Dad was too proud or too exhausted to stay. No one applauded or even acknowledged those moments. They simply expected it, took it for granted as if love was a transaction owed, rather than a gift freely given. Sitting there, the grief of years of invisibility gave way to a simmering anger. How dare they reduce my life's work, my love, to an accusation so cruel and so blatantly false? How could my own family applaud the lie that I never contributed? It wasn't just unfair. It was a calculated dismissal meant to erase the truth and keep me in my place. I leaned back against the worn couch, eyes scanning the room as if searching for the courage to move forward. The truth I'd held close was now a weapon waiting to be wielded. I knew that my family's dependence on me was deeper than just emotional. It was financial and practical. Without my mortgage payments, the house would be at risk. Without my caregiving, Mom's health would falter. This unspoken reliance was the family's secret, a truth they tried to ignore but couldn't survive without. That night, I resolved not to be the invisible pillar anymore. I resolved to stop absorbing their judgment and unfairness, to stop carrying burdens that were neither recognized nor reciprocated. The quiet acceptance that had defined my role for so long was over. I owed them nothing, not respect, not forgiveness, and certainly not my money. In the following days, I began mapping out my plan with meticulous care. Thomas and I sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the space as we spread out documents and laptops. He was my rock, the voice of reason and support when the storm inside me threatened to overwhelm. Together, we reviewed bank statements, insurance documents, caregiving logs, and even consulted with a trusted family attorney who specialized in elder law and financial matters. We explored my legal standing, the options for removing myself as a guarantor on the mortgage loan, and the implications for both my parents and me. I documented everything, every payment, every caregiving hour, every conversation that proved my long-standing commitment and their reliance. The paperwork was dense and intimidating, but it was also empowering. For the first time in years, I was wielding the truth as a shield, not a burden. I updated passwords on joint accounts, secured my financial profiles, and set up alerts for any activity involving the mortgage. This was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming control. I wasn't planning to leave my family stranded, but I was no longer going to be their secret savior without acknowledgement or respect. In my mind, I rehearsed the words I would say when the time came, the quiet, steady explanation that would dismantle their narrative and force them to confront what they had dismissed for so long. I envisioned the look on their faces when I presented the undeniable proof of my contributions, the silence that would follow, and the shifting of power that would ripple through the room. Throughout this process, I maintained my outward calm. To everyone else, I was still the dependable daughter, the caring sister, the quiet one who always showed up. But beneath that composed exterior, a new resolve was hardening. The family's comfortable status quo, the one that allowed Samuel's entitlement and my invisibility to exist side by side, was about to be unsettled. I knew this path wouldn't be easy. Confronting deep-rooted family dysfunction meant risking anger, disappointment, and estrangement. But the alternative, continuing to be erased and exploited, was no longer an option. I was ready to claim my worth, to set boundaries that would protect me and demand the respect I deserved. As I closed the folder of documents and looked out the window into the dark, quiet street, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The family's story had long been written without my voice. Now, it was time to rewrite the narrative on my own terms. The first move was mine, and I was ready. I started making small changes. Nothing dramatic at first, just subtle shifts in how I showed up for my family. It was a quiet rebellion, the kind that no one would notice right away, but one that signaled a boundary I was no longer willing to cross. The first was with the mortgage payments. Instead of sending the usual $6,000 on the first of the month like clockwork, I began to delay. Not by much at first, just a few days here, a week there. I wasn't trying to punish them outright, but I wanted them to feel what it was like when I wasn't instantly available, when my support wasn't automatic. I wondered how long it would take for them to notice. At the same time, I started saying no more often. When Mom called asking if I could pick her up for a doctor's appointment or help with groceries, I began to decline gently but firmly. "I'm sorry, Mom. I have a work deadline I can't miss." Or, "I've got the kids' schedules to manage today, so I won't be able to help." It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. But I knew that if I kept saying yes to every request, I would never be heard or seen as anything but the ever-present caretaker. Family events became another front in this quiet resistance. Invitations to dinners, weekend visits, or casual get-togethers started to go unanswered or received polite excuses. "I'm feeling overwhelmed with work," I'd say, or, "We have a lot going on with the kids right now." I felt a pang whenever I declined, knowing that these moments were the very places where I hoped to rebuild some connection. Yet I couldn't continue sacrificing my own peace for a family that didn't acknowledge me. At first, the family barely noticed. The mortgage payment delays were brushed off as a banking glitch or a busy schedule on my part. The missed caregiving requests were seen as temporary stress or fatigue. Even my absence at family gatherings was rationalized away as a passing phase. Their complacency, however, only deepened my resolve. They had become so used to my silent presence that my retreat unsettled their comfortable expectations. The quiet void I left was a mirror reflecting how much they truly relied on me, financially and emotionally, even if they pretended otherwise. Behind my composed demeanor, I kept my financial documents close, double-checking my accounts and tightening security on any shared family resources. I changed passwords I used to share casually, the joint accounts, the mortgage portal login, and set up alerts to notify me immediately of any activity. This was not just about control. It was about protecting what little power I had in a family dynamic that had long made me feel powerless. Thomas watched all this with a mix of concern and quiet pride. He understood the stakes better than anyone. "You're doing the right thing," he said one evening over dinner, his voice steady but gentle. "They've taken you for granted for too long. It's time they see that your generosity isn't endless." His support gave me strength, but I also knew this was my battle. I was preparing to face the fallout, the backlash, and the chaos I expected would follow. Despite the calm exterior I maintained, inside I felt a storm brewing. Every small no, every delayed payment, every missed call was a test of my resolve and the family's tolerance. I wondered how long they could keep pretending nothing was changing. How long before they confronted the reality that the house they lived in, both literally and figuratively, was standing on my quiet, unseen labor. I also wrestled with guilt. Was I being selfish? Was this retreat a betrayal of my family? The voices of doubt echoed, but they were quickly drowned out by a clearer, louder truth. I owed them nothing beyond respect, and respect was something I would now demand. I was done disappearing behind their narrow definitions of contribution. Each passing day of this quiet withdrawal crystallized my sense of self-worth. The family's entitlement no longer defined me. Their ignorance no longer silenced me. And as I drew boundaries that kept my resources and my heart safe, I felt the first real flickers of freedom. But I knew this was only the beginning. The family's complacency was fragile, and their reaction when they fully grasped what I was doing would be far from gentle. For now, I held my calm, my secrets, and my growing strength close. The unseen threads I'd been silently weaving were about to unravel the comfortable narrative they clung to, and I was ready to watch it unfold. The next family dinner felt different from the moment I walked into the room. The usual warmth was there, the familiar scent of roast chicken mingling with fresh herbs, the comfortable creak of the oak table as plates and glasses were set down. But beneath it all, I carried a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Thomas squeezed my hand gently as we took our seats, his calm presence steadying me against the nervous flutter in my chest. This wasn't going to be an ordinary meal. Samuel arrived with that same confident smirk, unaware that the script had shifted. His eyes briefly met mine as he sat down, but I held his gaze steadily. No hint of fear or retreat. The others were settling in, exchanging the usual small talk, but my mind was elsewhere. I wasn't here to engage in polite conversation tonight. I was here to change the story. When the meal was well underway, the moment I had rehearsed echoed in my mind. The clatter of forks slowed in my ears as I cleared my throat and spoke, my voice calm but firm. "I have something important to say." All eyes turned toward me. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. "For years," I began, "I've been told I never contribute to this family, that I don't do anything meaningful or valuable, that I'm, somehow, less than." I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. But I've kept a detailed record of my contributions, both financial and otherwise. And tonight, I want to set the record straight. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a neat stack of papers, bank statements, copies of checks, transaction confirmations, everything meticulously organized. I placed them carefully on the table, unfolding a bank statement to show the regular monthly payments of $6,000 that I had been sending toward the mortgage for years. These payments have kept this house standing. Every month, without fail, I've been covering a massive portion of our family's mortgage. I saw my father's eyes widen as he caught sight of the documents, an involuntary tightening of his jaw. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her napkin, dabbing at her lips with a pallor that deepened by the second. Across the table, Samuel's smug expression faltered, his confident mask slipping for a brief moment. I continued, voice unwavering. But it's not just the money. I've been there for Mom when she needed care, coordinating doctor visits, managing medications. I've paid for home repairs, helped with bills, and sacrificed my own time and savings to keep this family afloat. The room grew heavier with silence. No polite chatter, no nervous laughter, just the stark truth laid bare. My husband squeezed my hand again, his silent support fortifying me as I delivered the final blow. Effective immediately. I'm stopping the mortgage payments. I've also spoken with our attorney and removed myself as guarantor on the house loan. A sudden coughing interrupted the room. My father, caught off guard, choked on his drink, the glass trembling in his hand. He gasped, eyes darting wildly as he tried to regain composure. My mother's pale face betrayed her shock, lips pressed tightly together as she stared down at the table, avoiding any eye contact. Samuel opened his mouth to object, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. For once, the narrative was no longer mine to control. This was their reality to face. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each family member. There was no anger in my gaze, no bitterness, just quiet resolve. I'm not doing this to punish anyone, I said softly. I'm doing this because respect and acknowledgement aren't optional anymore. If you want my support, it must come with recognition of what I've already given and what I expect moving forward. The words hung in the air, a clear boundary drawn, firm and unyielding. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The comfortable illusion of the family's financial stability cracked open, exposing the fragile dependency they had on me, the invisible pillar they had taken for granted. My mother's fingers curled nervously around her glass. My father's posture stiffened, and Samuel's confident facade dissolved into something close to panic. The dinner continued after a long pause, but the atmosphere was forever changed. The room that once echoed with the routine of family life now felt charged with tension, the unspoken challenge I'd planted at the heart of the gathering undeniable. I sat back, feeling a quiet strength settle over me, knowing that the next steps would be difficult, but necessary. For the first time in years, the family had no choice but to reckon with the truth, and I was ready to watch as that reckoning unfolded. The moment I announced that the mortgage payments were stopping, the atmosphere at the table shifted instantly, like the calm before a storm breaking into a fierce gale. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged, heavy with disbelief and rising panic. I could see it in their faces: shock, confusion, and then fear. The familiar veneer of control cracked, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. My father was the first to lose his composure. He choked on his drink, a sudden cough ripping through the room as he struggled to swallow. His hand trembled slightly, clutching the glass, eyes wide and darting as if searching for a solution that didn't exist. That proud, commanding man, the patriarch who always projected strength, now looked exposed and fragile. His usual stern expression melted into something unguarded, a mixture of incredulity and silent desperation. My mother's reaction was more subtle, but no less telling. Her face drained of color, the usual warmth replaced by a ghostly pallor. Her hands clutched at the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as she tried to steady herself against the weight of the news. She avoided my gaze completely, eyes fixed on the worn wood beneath the table, as if willing herself to disappear. The realization that the financial safety net she'd always depended on was unraveling must have struck her like a blow. Samuel's initial smug confidence evaporated like mist. His mouth opened, ready to launch into a tirade or a counterattack, but the words caught in his throat. I could see his mind racing, the gears turning behind his eyes as he grasped the gravity of what I'd just revealed. His usual arsenal of charm and manipulation faltered. The applause he had enjoyed mere meals ago was replaced by a suffocating quiet that swallowed his bravado whole. The rest of the family froze. Some stared in disbelief, others exchanged worried glances. My children's faces mirrored a mix of pride and concern, while Thomas's steady presence beside me was a silent pillar of support. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then came the flood. Samuel lashed out, his voice sharp and accusatory, desperate to regain control. "You can't just stop paying the mortgage. What do you expect us to do? Mom and Dad are going to lose the house because of you." His words, dripping with blame, were meant to shame me back into submission, but I was done shrinking. I met his fury calmly. "I'm not here to be your bank or your scapegoat anymore," I said, voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "I've given more than enough. If you want this family to survive, it has to be on terms of respect, not entitlement." My parents jumped into the fray, their voices trembling as they shifted from shock to pleading. "Jacqueline, please, we never meant for this to happen," my mother stammered, her hands reaching out as if to grasp some fragment of the old harmony. "We need you. The house, the bills. Without you, we don't know what to do." My father's tone was harsher, tinged with wounded pride. "You're tearing this family apart. You owe us. After everything." Their pleas, layered with guilt and manipulation, swirled around me like a cyclone. But I had steel beneath my skin now. I shook my head gently, refusing to be drawn into their emotional trap. "I owe you honesty. I owe you boundaries. But I don't owe you blind obedience or endless sacrifice." Extended family members who had gathered nearby attempted to mediate, their voices rising in attempts to calm the storm. "Let's all take a breath," one aunt suggested, her tone cautious but firm. "Jacqueline, maybe there's a compromise here?" But I knew better. This wasn't a moment for negotiation. It was a reckoning. Bills began to pile up in reality, the mortgage company's reminders growing more urgent by the day. The facade of financial stability they had relied on shattered, exposing the harsh truth that without my support, the Lynch household faced imminent crisis. The tension at home was palpable. Phone calls from creditors, whispered arguments between my parents, the stress tightening like a noose around everyone's throats. Samuel's attacks evolved into guilt trips and threats, trying to make me the villain in a story where I had been the unsung hero for years. "You're abandoning your family," he accused. "You're selfish." But the truth was raw and undeniable. They had depended on me, taken my generosity for granted, and refused to see me as anything more than a source of endless supply. Their fragile facade cracked open, revealing how weak it was beneath the surface. Through it all, I remained firm. I didn't raise my voice or lash out in anger. Instead, I let my silence and quiet defiance speak volumes. This was not a battle I intended to win with bitterness, but with unwavering boundaries. The family's scramble to adjust to this new reality was chaotic and painful, but it was necessary. As the crisis deepened, the rifts grew wider. Some relatives whispered doubts about Samuel's character. Others reached out to me privately, expressing regret or surprise. But the damage to the old family dynamic was done. The comfortable illusion had shattered, and the Lynch family was forced to confront the truth they had long ignored. In the eye of this storm, I found an unexpected clarity. The panic, the accusations, the desperate pleas, they all underscored one truth. My family had never truly seen me for who I am. But now, with the scales falling from their eyes, I was no longer invisible. The consequences were unfolding rapidly, and with each passing day, the power dynamics were shifting. The question now was not if they would adjust, but how, and at what cost. The days after my announcement brought a whirlwind of chaos that rippled far beyond that tense family dinner. The mortgage payments I'd stopped suddenly became the epicenter of every whispered conversation and frantic call. Without the $6,000 flowing in every month like clockwork, the financial foundation that had seemed so stable for years crumbled with alarming speed. It was as if the house itself began to groan under the weight of neglected bills and mounting interest notices, things no one wanted to face until the very last moment. My parents, once so proud and unflappable, now scrambled visibly to contain the fallout. I could hear the strain in their voices during the calls I intercepted when I was nearby. Mom pleading for extensions, Dad speaking quietly but sharply with creditors. The veneer of strength they'd maintained for decades cracked like old paint, revealing deep worry and fear. Their lifestyle, once comfortably cushioned by my monthly support, suddenly had to shrink. Luxuries that had been quietly taken for granted, the occasional dinners out, new furniture, even simple extras like cable or subscriptions, were suddenly up for debate. The whole family felt the pinch, and the consequences weren't subtle. Samuel's reaction was a volatile mix of desperation and rage. Where once he'd flaunted entitlement with ease, now his public image was fraying before my eyes, and before the eyes of the family and community who had revered him for so long. The man who had once commanded attention effortlessly was reduced to scrambling for excuses, blaming me for breaking the family apart, and throwing us all into financial ruin. His usual charm was replaced by shaky defenses and bitter accusations aimed squarely at me. "You're selfish!" he spat during one heated phone call I overheard, his voice cracking with frustration. "You don't care about Mom and Dad." But the truth was undeniable for everyone else who took a moment to really look. The rumors began to spread quietly at first. Neighbors, family friends, even distant relatives who had only heard the polished version of Lynch family life were now hearing a different story. Samuel's reputation as the golden child who could do no wrong was tarnished by the revelation that the family finances were propped up almost entirely by me. Whispers of his entitlement and manipulation floated through social circles, casting long shadows over his previously untouchable status. Some relatives who had long admired him began to question their assumptions, and the social ripple was palpable. Meanwhile, others in the family took sides with varying degrees of regret or stubborn denial. A few cousins and aunts reached out to me privately, their voices soft and full of sympathy. "Jacqueline, we had no idea," one whispered over the phone, her tone heavy with guilt. "You've been carrying this burden alone? It's not right." These moments of connection, while small, were a balm to my bruised heart. Yet, not everyone was willing or able to change. Some doubled down on blame, accusing me of overreacting or being divisive, further deepening the rifts. It was clear that the fractures within the Lynch family were not just financial. They were deeply emotional and entrenched. The household itself became a pressure cooker of tension. Bills piled up, arguments flared, and the long-ignored realities of dependency and entitlement burst to the surface. I could sense the shifting power dynamics. Finally, the family had to reckon with the fact that I was not just an invisible contributor, but a vital force they could no longer take for granted. Yet, this reckoning came at a cost. The delicate balance of family harmony shattered, replaced by awkward silences, cold shoulders, and the painful work of facing uncomfortable truths. Despite the turmoil swirling around me, I stayed centered. I refused to be drawn into the cycle of blame and manipulation. My boundaries remained firm. Even as the family tried to guilt trip and pressure me, I kept my resolve. I understood now that respect isn't given freely in my family. It has to be demanded and enforced. The cost of silence was too high, and the price of invisibility had become unbearable. Through all of this, I discovered a strange clarity. The crisis exposed not just the family's reliance on me, but the lies they told themselves to maintain their comfortable narrative. The facade of unity and mutual support had always been fragile, sustained by my quiet sacrifices and their willful blindness. Now, that facade was crumbling, and the real Lynch family was coming into view. Complex, flawed, and desperately in need of healing or transformation. The question that loomed large, hanging over every conversation and interaction, was no longer about my role or worth. It was whether they could, or would, change. Could the family grow from this reckoning? Could Samuel confront his entitlement? Could Mom and Dad acknowledge the truth without retreating into denial? Or would they dig in, letting resentment and blame deepen the divide? Their choice remained uncertain, but one thing was clear to me. I had stepped out of the shadows. I was no longer invisible. The fire I'd ignited with my truth had set this family's world aflame, and now it was up to all of us to decide what would rise from the ashes. The days and weeks that followed the family's financial unraveling forced me into an uncharted territory of clarity and choice. The quiet strength I thought I had found during that confrontation began to crystallize into something more enduring. A new way of being in relation to the people who shared my blood, but had long failed to truly see me. I realized that the old rules, the expectations of silent sacrifice, of invisible support, of unconditional forgiveness, no longer applied to me. I began to build new boundaries, carefully and firmly. Boundaries weren't just about financial decisions. They were about reclaiming my emotional space and dignity. Phone calls from my parents, which once carried unspoken demands, now came with gentle but steady reminders that I was no longer available at a moment's notice. When Mom asked for help with errands or medical appointments, I responded with kindness, but clarity. I'm happy to help when I can, but I have to plan ahead. This isn't something I can do on a whim anymore. It wasn't easy to say no, but each time I did, I felt a little more of the weight lift from my shoulders. Family invitations became a test of what I was willing to give and receive. I started attending only those gatherings where respect was present, where my contributions, whether as a listener, a helper, or simply a daughter, were acknowledged. The dinners where Samuel's snide remarks hung in the air were left behind. The family holidays filled with judgment and exclusion became optional, no longer obligations to endure, but choices I made from a place of self-respect. My relationship with my parents changed too. They were forced to confront the reality that without my involvement, their financial world was precarious. The fragile pride that had once kept them silent broke down, and for the first time, I heard hesitant apologies mixed with requests for understanding. But those words felt fragile, still wrapped in old patterns of defense and denial. I knew change required more than words. It required action and consistency. Samuel, who had wielded his charm like a shield against accountability, found himself isolated in new ways. His attempts to manipulate and guilt-trip me only revealed his own vulnerability and the cracks in his carefully crafted image. Some family members began to see what I always knew, that entitlement and favoritism had poisoned our family dynamic. Others, however, clung to old loyalties and blamed me for rocking the boat. The division was painful, but it was also necessary. The facade of unity had been a fragile illusion sustained by silence and invisibility. In the midst of this upheaval, my husband Thomas and my children became my sanctuary. Their unwavering support and belief in me were anchors in a shifting sea. I no longer sought validation from the Lynch family. Instead, I cultivated it within my chosen circle of love and respect. Together, we built a quieter, healthier version of family, a place where boundaries were honored and contributions were seen, not just assumed. I also found unexpected freedom in stepping away from the old scripts. I wasn't defined by the role of the invisible giver or the scapegoat. Instead, I was a woman who had chosen herself, who demanded dignity and fairness, who understood that respect is not a given in bloodlines, but something earned through acknowledgement and care. This was not about severing ties, but about reshaping connections on terms that honored my worth. The Lynch family's reckoning was far from over. There were moments of tension, setbacks, and silence. Some doors closed, others opened slowly, hesitantly. I learned that healing and growth are uneven, that respect must be continually negotiated, and that self-worth cannot be outsourced to those who refuse to see it. But I stood firm, no longer willing to be invisible or taken for granted. In choosing boundaries, I reclaimed my voice and my power. I embraced a new family dynamic, one defined not by obligation or denial, but by mutual respect and accountability. The old patterns had been disrupted, and while the future remained uncertain, I stepped forward with a quiet confidence that was hard-won and deeply rooted. This was my life, my story, and my peace to protect. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen,